So Beowulf as a text is an interesting text, and just the way that the story comes to us in and of itself is somewhat interesting. Unlike a lot of other epics, there's only one surviving manuscript of Beowulf, and it's currently housed in the British Library. And you're looking at a page of it right here on the right. This text traded over hands and kind of preserved in different monasteries throughout the centuries at one point endured a fire, and we'll see a little bit later in the Beowulf text that there's a portion of it that we just don't know what it is anymore, because there was no other cooperating text to help us kind of understand what might have been, and it was burned up and it was lost, and scholars and translators kind of have to figure out what to do with that. The fact that there's only one surviving manuscript is a unique thing for these older epics. Just recently, well, last summer, archaeologists think that they discovered the oldest Greek copy of Homer's Odyssey, which is 13 verses on a clay pot in Greece. Prior to that, in the 19th century, they had found a huge aspect of the Iliad, and they found it in Egypt, which is remarkable, the ways that these stories were traveling. So to only have one copy of the Beowulf text is a very interesting translation issue, and try to figure out how to tell this story the best way possible. In the text itself, we'll see some elements that are indicative of a cultural clash of the kind that we've been describing in this juxtaposition between the Anglo-Saxon community and its pagan origins and its kind of newly Christianized influence as well. And so there's a lot of scholars throughout time who have looked at Beowulf and looked at the Christian elements and said, well, this was just a editorial decision by a later monk who, while transcribing this piece, just took some creative liberties and added in a bunch of Christian stuff. And that has been a source of contention and confusion about this poem for a long time. So a couple things about the story itself. It's written in England, though it's set in Scandinavia. So Beowulf is from Geatland, which is southern Sweden, modern-day southern Sweden, and he comes from Sweden to the aid of the Danes, Hamlet and his ilk here in Denmark. The story itself is relying on those old Germanic legends and Norse myths. So again, we have a lot of confusing names that haven't kind of made their way into the Western canon, even though in many ways England is more of a forebearer for us than the Greeks and the Romans, and yet here's this thing that's written in our own language of English that has not made its way as much into our vernacular as those old Greek and Roman stories. The poem itself includes many stories within stories, none of which we'll read. But it is interesting that there are regular moments in the story where the Beowulf poet kind of takes a break and lets in another voice, and there are two notable times when another storyteller comes in to tell a kind of complete tale in and of itself. And this is modeled on the kind of thing that would have happened in these Anglo-Saxon communities, where bards would have sang songs of heroic deeds of old. And that sense of history and culture is an aspect of Beowulf that's a very compelling aspect. Again, though not one we will focus on too much. So, of course, translation issues come up with only one copy, and divergent themes in the text suggested multiple authors until J.R.R. Tolkien wrote and delivered a lecture called The Monsters and the Critics. And Seamus Heaney, who's the translator for this edition that we'll be reading, more on him in a second, says this about Tolkien. Tolkien assumed the Beowulf poet was an imaginative writer rather than some kind of back formation derived from 19th century folklore. Tolkien's brilliant literary treatment changed the way the poem was valued and initiated a new era of appreciation. And that was in the middle of the 20th century. And since then, Beowulf has continued to enjoy a prominence in both high school and college syllabi. So Seamus Heaney is the translator for this edition of Beowulf that was released in 2000, within most of our lifetimes. That's not true, is it, anymore? Within my lifetime. Seamus Heaney won the Nobel Prize. He comes from County Derry in Northern Ireland. And in his introduction, he says this about translating Beowulf. I came to the task of translating Beowulf with a prejudice in favor of forthright delivery. I remembered the voice of the poem as being attractively direct, even though the diction was ornate and the narrative method at times oblique. What I had always loved was a kind of four-squareness about the utterance, a feeling of living inside a constantly indicative mood, in the presence of an understanding that assumes you share an awareness of the perilous nature of life and are yet capable of seeing it steadily and, when necessary, sternly. The evidence suggests that this middle ground between oral tradition and the demands of written practice was also the ground occupied by the Beowulf poet. The style of the poem is hospitable to the kind of formulaic phrases which are the stock and trade of oral bards, and yet it is marked too by the self-consciousness of an artist convinced that we must labor to be beautiful, which is a quote from a William Butler Yeats poem. What Haney's saying here is, here's an interesting thing about this story. It has these elements of the oral tradition, certain cliches, certain images that are easily conveyed when you're memorizing and telling a tale, but it also has a clear sense of being written and a story that's been written down and preserved, and it's to be heard and it's to be read. And so in his own way, Haney has attempted to bridge that gap in this translation. For all of us, I'll be including an audio version of Beowulf that you can hear Seamus Haney in his rich Northern Irish accent read these lines. And virtual students, I encourage you to use that because hearing this gives you that old sense of what it might have been like centuries and centuries ago, millennia ago, to sit in the King's Hall with meat roasting on the hearth and listen to someone tell a story of legends of old and old victories. Okay, so the story itself is structured around 3 different monsters and 3 different settings. So in the beginning of the story, Beowulf is arriving amongst the Danes to rid their country of evil monsters. And so the first monster invades close to home. He invades the king's hall, and so Beowulf must take stance against this monster in the barricaded night house. But after he defeats the monster at home, there's another monster that's going to crop up, and so Beowulf has to go out into the wilderness, into another kind of archetypal and common setting to destroy the monster in the infested underwater current. Then we'll have a 50-year break in Beowulf, a break that is also in the text, though we'll take a shortened version of the full text, and we'll jump to an older Beowulf, returned home to Geatland, king there of the Geats, when he'll be asked to face one more monster, this reptile who is haunting the rocks of the wilderness.